So my name is Michael. I'm going to be your host for this meeting. And today we have Rachel Lewis, who will be talking about centering food garden and prison education. And before we start, I would like to go over some details. The meeting is being recorded. We'd like to acknowledge the land we're on, and we are presenting this conference from land that was stolen from the Nipmuc people. So this land that we're on today is the ancestral land of the Nipmuc people. And if you'd like to get more information about native land, you can go to native-land.ca. Also, yeah, we recognize that our agricultural system is built on stolen land and the forced labor and exploitation of stolen Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And our conference aims to help to address this harm and bring equity into the food system. And yeah, this conference is able to happen thanks to these partners and sponsors. These are other supporters. Also, there is an auction going on. There are QR codes outside the door if you want to get more information about it or get into a bid. And there's also a survey for at the end of the presentation if you'd like to give feedback about the presentation.
All right, is that clear for folks?
Yeah, it looks good here.
Great. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Rachel Lewis, Development and Operations Manager of the New Garden Society. Thank you very much for that hopeful welcome and orientation. We just want to get started by introducing our director who's actually able to be with us today, Renee Portanova. She's going to give us some insight into kind of the background and structure of our programs. I'll be talking a little bit about applications to food and food justice, since that's the theme many of us have been talking about at the conference this weekend so far. And we'll make sure to leave plenty of room for questions. We see folks have already added a couple in the app. So thank you so much for that. Renee, I'm going to go ahead and switch it so you can start whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Rachel. I'll just use this opportunity to briefly say good morning to all the NOFA attendees. You know, this is probably maybe the 8th or 9th time that the New Garden Society has presented at this winter conference. And we're grateful to NOFA and to all the attendees that there's interest and the platform to do so. So just acknowledging that. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and then maybe give Rachel an opportunity to introduce herself in the larger sense of her personhood. And then I'll start telling you a little bit. We'll jump right into the presentation. So I'm a horticulturist by training and an environmental educator. And I currently work, my day job is working at a cemetery that is also an arboretum as lead horticulturist there. Have worked throughout my career in both the for-profit and nonprofit communities and public gardening. And I founded the New Garden Society with my co-founder, Erica Brumbley, in 2013. Erica is also a professional in the green industry. She is the director of horticulture at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, with a strong standing in the organic farming community, her previous position, working in the greenhouse there. So that's a little bit about who the founders are, who I am presenting to you today. And then Rachel has joined our organization just about a year ago. So we're thrilled to have her participate today in her inaugural NOFA Winter Conference presentation. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks. Yeah. So like Renee said, I've been an employee of the New Garden Society since April of last year. So I've had sort of one full growing season with the team that's been really enlightening and exciting, and has just really created a lot of new directions for how I've done gardening and incarceration work in the past, which I've pursued both, but in pretty separate ways. So I am active in the community garden circle in my home in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. I'm a community coordinator there. And in my professional life outside of TNGS, I'm a graduate student and a writing instructor. And a lot of my work in prisons has been around education and literacy. So it's been just really fascinating to move from literacy to eco-literacy this year. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you all about that.
Wonderful, thanks, Rachel. So this is just a quick agenda of today. We're going to discuss our mission and our work. We'll briefly discuss who goes to prison in the United States. Why horticulture, why we believe horticulture is part of the answer in addressing the social injustices of our prison system. And we'll also discuss our pedagogical approach in our teachings, how we run our programs, how we train our volunteers, connecting food to the prison. And then we'll at the end have the opportunity to talk about how you can get involved, either with the New Garden Society or starting a similar program in your neck of the woods. And then leaving plenty of time at the end of the presentation, about 20 minutes for questions and comments. I believe we also have someone, Caroline, attending from the Sheriff's County, the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. And we invite Caroline to speak about her programming at the end of this session as well. So the New Garden Society was really founded under this premise that we're all, meaning green industry professionals, are really passionate about the work that we do. We enjoy our careers, maybe not every day, but we really feel like our career is a path to right livelihood, and that it is not only important work, but it's accessible work. And that with a little bit of training, a lot of doors can open up for individuals who are incarcerated to enter into this green industry world of ours. And we've done that over the last 10 years by transforming the prison landscapes into viable gardens, both vegetable and ornamental gardens that are both a food source and a classroom, an outdoor experience, you know, an opportunity to be in nature, both in the vocational sense and in the therapeutic sense. We know that all of our students are not looking for a vocation. We know that all of our students are not re-entering into our society. And we do know that there are many, many therapeutic benefits in the act of gardening, both anecdotally, and we see that from the scientific community as well. So our mission has really been driven to get programming into these facilities and expose that world to as many incarcerated or detained people as possible in the greater Boston area. And if there's any words that I use that you don't understand or feel confusing, like the difference between incarcerated and detained, really briefly detained is the word that we use for youth who are incarcerated. Please feel free to stop me. So some of the highlights of our work in recent years have been that just the exposure and the amount of programming that we've brought to our students, both young people that are in the system through DYS, and both men and women programs, both in the county jails and also in the state-run prisons. Additionally, especially over 2020, we were really able to begin connecting our students with green industry professionals, or what we like to call green industry allies. So those are companies in the green industry that are enthusiastic and supportive of hiring formerly incarcerated people. Maybe even they make it part of their mission to do so. And also connecting people that are in the green industry as individuals with our students so that they can share different aspects of the industry. I mean, it's a vast industry. There's a lot of different niches within that industry. And so we have a real diverse volunteer staff that comes in and speaks with our students. Will you just go back for one moment, Rachel? I just want to look at that. And then we've been a resource for other professionals who are doing this kind of work in the Northeast and across the United States. And that's culminated into a national conference that was held this past summer in Seattle. And you can find more information about that national collaboration at prisongardensjustice.org. Great. Thanks.
Great. We want to talk a little bit about the prison population in general. It's gotten a little more scrutiny over the past few years, but just some highlights to remind us why prisons are a social justice issue. Black and Hispanic communities are disproportionately incarcerated, as are queer and LGBTQ people. People living in poverty who lack access to high quality educational resources are disproportionately incarcerated. I'll also add that people who have been diagnosed with learning disabilities are also disproportionately incarcerated. And broadly speaking, 95% of people in incarceration will return to the community. So we also do this with the knowledge that we are not just trying to change the shape of things inside for some incarcerated people, but that this is something that intervenes in the community as well. In Massachusetts, out of every 100 people who are released from prison, 32 of them will be incarcerated again within 3 years. So that should give you a little bit of a sense of the kind of in and out that can happen in incarcerating spaces, and like what the role of the garden is in both helping to lower that recidivism and also work within the realization that people are cycling in and out of these facilities, and in some cases in and out of their work with us. I also want to note that people who are incarcerated have deep and long-standing connections to agricultural systems. Through convict leasing, many incarcerated people produce food, not necessarily for vocational or therapeutic skills, as Renee was highlighting in our programs, but for production, particularly in Idaho, particularly certain kinds of crops, potatoes, melons. And there is, of course, a historical relationship between American slave plantations, which were coercively farmed, and current prisons with, a couple notable examples of plantations that transitioned directly into incarceration work after the abolition of slavery. So I just want to sketch out those connections to help us keep in mind like what we're thinking about when we think about bringing gardening into prison, the ways that people are already kind of by consent or not entangled in these systems. And I think that will give us some real insight into our next section, why horticulture in these spaces, and also later on as we continue to discuss our programs, how we can establish a sense of agency to marginalized populations, since that's the majority of who we're working with when we're talking about people incarcerated in the United States.
Thanks, Rachel. So why is horticulture part of the answer? Well, I think I touched on some of that. We can kind of approach it from a logistical standpoint to answer this question. We could talk about how some of the obstacles that incarcerated people face when they re-enter community is not suited for certain types of careers or certain types of work, but are generally more less of an obstacle, more of a non-issue in a lot of green industry professions. So what do I mean by that? I mean, a lot of times individuals who are incarcerated have lost their driver's license. They might have a lot of time constraints during the week or a very unreliable schedule that has to have a fair amount of flexibility tied into it. Those are just a couple of the ways in which we feel like the green industry is more sympathetic, and also logistically, it's not as challenging as it might be in other professions. But so from a philosophical or from scientific standpoint, we know a couple of things about the act of gardening. There's a lot of research around this. It's not something the New Garden Society invented. It's been around for a very long time, that horticulture can be a very therapeutic act for many individuals. The physical nature of the work, the exposure to fresh food, the act of nurturing a plant, the sunlight on your face, the rain on your face, all of that has therapeutic aspects to it. There is also a healthy dose of maybe ecological anxiety that I think some of our students face, but especially if they're not familiar with a certain insect or don't like getting their hands dirty. But I think even in that process, it's a distraction. It can be a distraction from what is taking place in the sort of normalcy of trauma within a jail or prison. Additionally, we know that in Massachusetts and across the United States, the green industry has been growing continuously, and we are very much in the need of a strong body of skilled laborers. And this skill and this talent and this knowledge does not come at the cost of going to a four-year college or getting an advanced degree. It can be done with experience and training in the field, and and with little or a lot of different experiences. So horticulture, again, as a form of right livelihood, within our programming, we teach the science and art of horticulture. We teach soil sciences, we teach botany, we teach, as you saw, will you go back to that slide, Rachel, please? We teach how to harvest and things of that nature, but we're also teaching those soft skills that we bring into every job experience, having people work as a team, having people rely on one another, delegate responsibilities, execute those responsibilities. And then you get down to the nitty-gritty of actually gardening. So again, just to kind of highlight, as this slide does, you know, why is the horticulture industry more accessible? Because the quarry and the sorry may not be asked for. The driver's license isn't going to be required. And there's such a need for skilled laborers. I mean, even during the pandemic, we saw areas of the green industry really just taking off as the rest of the world was shutting down. And I can tell you from both my professional experience and the professional experiences of you know, colleagues and people within our industry, finding good help has become increasingly difficult from year to year. There's just not enough availability of individuals that are seeking out these professions. And it, you know, horticulture can happen in a densely populated urban environment and also in a rural community, and sort of it's all around us in so many different forms. There is no shortage of the type of work that you can do in the green industry or the locations in which that work would be taking place. So, okay, we can go. Yeah, there we go. So how did we end up in carceral systems? Well, it started, like I said, in 2013. And, you know, there was many established programming in the United States, including a programming in New York City at Rikers Island that was started and sort of carried through for 20 years by a man named James Giller. And that what caught the interest of some of us in Massachusetts, the work that was being done at Rikers Island. So we reached out to the DOC here in our state and were invited to participate and create programming for a couple of facilities. And it's interesting, without getting bogged down with with sort of the bureaucracy of the DOC, we were welcomed into facilities under the jurisdiction of the Director of Treatment, which you can kind of think of it as programming that would be in par with like religious services and yoga and things of that nature, rather than a program that was housed under the Education Department. For lots of reasons, a lot having to do with money and resources, to be quite honest. So all of our work programs that are in current facilities are housed under this idea that our programming is offered to residents of that facility as part of a therapeutic practice rather than an educational program. And it has its relevance mostly in the funding that's available. So that's something to really consider if you, for example, are here today at this workshop thinking about starting a program at a facility near you. But we'll get back to that. If you guys have specific questions, we can kind of unpack that a little bit further. So our pedagogical approach, we have weekly sessions that run us 2 hours a week from April through November. All the individuals that are attending the session, the programming, all of our attendees, I should say, all the people coming in for the New Garden Society are professionals in the green industry that have volunteered to share their skills in these prison classrooms. All of our students, thankfully, are there by consent. No one, and because they've signed up, they're on a waiting list. They're kind of the creme de la creme of the prison population. for the most part, they are individuals that have proven to their team within the facility that they are capable and interested in being part of this program. So it's been a real pleasure just to teach adults who are just so thankful and appreciative and interested in what they're learning about. From a philosophical standpoint, our pedagogical approach surrounds sort of these 4 tenets, and Rachel kind of brought up one in their introduction, being eco-literacy. So, and then we also have participatory education, emancipatory education, and trauma-informed correctional care. And as I go through these different philosophies, you may recognize some of them from maybe I know I attended a little informational session that NOFA had put together on how to be a good presenter for these workshops. And you might see, if you were a presenter or they did something for the attendees of the conference, you might see a lot of overlap in their presentation and sort of our classroom approach. It's not your standard classroom where you have a teacher in front of the class sort of directing and dictating to the classroom, you know, how everything's going to play out. So we'll jump into those philosophies one by one. So trauma-informed correctional care sort of operates under the premise that everyone that's incarcerated or detained, and everyone who works in those environments, so including our DOC or HOC colleagues, the administration, the social workers, the treatment team, the nurses, are all experiencing a tremendous amount of trauma from physically existing in that space. And that many people who are incarcerated have also experienced traumatic events or trauma in their lives, which may have led them to being incarcerated in the first place. So we want all of our educators, it's a very strong component of our programming. We want all our educators to sort of follow these objectives when it comes to trauma-informed care in our programming. So we're being mindful of race and cultural backgrounds, cultural differences, through empathy and compassion. We're understanding trauma and stress. So, so understanding the impact of our presence, understanding how to react or carry yourself in an environment that's innately stressful. And we're also teaching recovery and resilience by demonstrating that the physical landscape can be changed through the act of gardening, the nurturing of plants, the physical garden itself. Gardens are grounding, they're a place of nourishment. So safety and stability is another aspect of this. Really having the garden be a safe space in many aspects. So this can mean a lot of things. So like a safe space could even be in the context of a prison, an opportunity for someone, a student, to completely vent and go on and on about the injustices that they're feeling. It might be an opportunity to allow a student to be off in the corner, just weeding on their own, doing their own thing, while we're carrying on a lesson someplace else, because that student just needs to be able to feel and and have it be untethered, unfiltered, because that is not, there are not many places within the prison walls where someone has the opportunity to have a breath of emotions. So in that respect, the garden plays a huge role in that as well. So another way in which we practice our trauma-informed correctional care is by collaborating and empowering our students. So often our students take on very specific roles within the garden, and most decisions are made in collaboration with their input, engaging students in the planning and execution of the garden, what happens to the produce, how we run our class, what topics we may want to introduce or not introduce, are all influenced by the input of our students. Again, we're not there to kind of come in and be like, this is what you need to know, and this is how it's going to go. We're really there to facilitate the learning that they're all bringing to the table, the knowledge that they all have and want to explore surrounding horticulture. We're just there to kind of make it all make sense. And then lastly, but certainly not least of all, collaboration and dependability. So compassion being, how it plays out is sort of like, not whatever you got going on as an educator in your life, really leaving it at the front door, right? It's not about you when you walk through that door, when you walk through that pedestrian trap and you're inside their home. Whatever you got going on in your life is just totally put on hold, and you're there, you're present, you're really just focused on what is happening there with your students at the moment. And not only are you there, but you're there on time, and you're there every week, which is a very, it sounds so simple, but it's a really, really big part of, working with individuals who experience a lot of trauma, because they're not used to, individuals are not used to dependability and consistency in that manner. So that's trauma-informed care. And you'll see that all of these philosophies really tie into one another and sort of overlap. They are not individual philosophies. They kind of make up this whole genre of emancipatory education. I'll just speak very briefly about a little bit more about those philosophies of like emancipatory education. A lot of the same tenets you see in trauma-informed care, especially like giving a group of individuals, a community, the ability to have a democratic society, which people who are incarcerated absolutely do not have a democratic society in any way. All of their rights have been taken away from them, and they have no voice. And when we're in the garden, we've restored that democracy to these individuals, because they are able to have a voice and they are equals. And not only are they our equals, but I'll even go so far as saying, safety and security aside, they are really the ones that are influencing and directing the programming that is happening at their facility. And then I'll just say about eco-literacy is just giving them the language and the vocabulary and really practicing observation skills to understand the natural world. So some examples of that can be described as like knowing what phase the moon is in. Like, oh, it's this time of the month, so the lunar phases must be where we're at, or like recognizing a native plant or recognizing an insect as a benefit to the garden rather than a predator or a pest species. That is all part of the eco-literacy that we're trying to teach in these environments. And so many of us, me included, even though I've been working in this world for many years, are still so unfamiliar with the natural environment that is around us, right? So it's a practice. A lot of these components to eco-literacy and our observations are a practice and not anything that we will, hopefully we will master at some point. But I mean, there's still many days where I hear a bird calling or come across a plant and I'm like completely clueless. And I think of myself as being relatively literate when it comes to the ecology that surrounds us. So moving on, this is kind of what is up on the slide is a sample of our curriculum. So like I said, we teach weekly, April through November, and those teachings are broken up into 4 different units, and those units are based on where we are in the growing season rather. And the season starting in April, we're focusing mostly on site assessment and design, understanding the light and soil requirements or water accessibility and other such factors in our garden, understanding propagation, understanding how to prep the site and really start gearing up for the bulk of the growing season is in Unit 1. And as we progress into the summer seasons, we're focusing on pest and disease and weeds, and we're focusing on plant health and what makes plants healthy. And then we kind of shift into harvesting practices. And really towards the end of the season, once things are kind of up and running and we have a good rapport, we start introducing a lot of our guest presenters who might come in and present about their specific niche within the green industry. So historically, we've had individuals come in and talk about herbalism, beekeeping, seed propagation, seed saving, the politics of seed saving. We don't keep it, we get politics involved quite often in our class, and things on that nature. And then towards the end of the season, we're focused on keeping the, wrapping up for the season by putting the garden to bed, but also like creating continuity for the following season, planting our garlic bulbs, planting our ornamental bulbs, making sure perennials are well mulched so that when we come back in the spring, there's still that connection going in full circle. So we present this curriculum to the facilities that we are going to do programming at. If it's a new facility, they might need more or less information than just providing a syllabus to the administration there. We also share this with our students, and the way that we shape each session, each individual unit or each individual class within the units is by creating concept questions to help our students really pull out what are the key concepts that we want them to identify and hold on to by being taught this particular topic. And we lay it all out right in the beginning of the season. This helps us to also evaluate our programming through self-assessment at the end of each unit and at the end of the year as well through these concept questions.
Yeah, and as you can see, our curriculum is posted on our website. I'm also happy to give more information about that should anyone want to reach out. It is really important to us that folks who are interested in running classes or workshops or any kind of interventions that brings horticulture into prisons feel like they have access to some template tools should they need them. And we're definitely always happy to have our work looked at through that lens. We are going to put that aside for now and just talk a little bit more about applications of participatory education and trauma-informed correctional care in the classroom. But the website's there if folks want to look into it. And of course, I'm also available to talk further. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about food access and our educational approaches, or just like the role of food and the food garden in our educational approaches, both in keeping with the theme of the conference and because it gives us some kind of up close ways to look at the principles of education, participatory, democratic, trauma-informed, that Renee was explaining to us in a broader sense before and giving us a really large overview. So this year for me, a lot of this is through some of my and Renee's observations. Others are stories that other educators have shared with me or discussed as significant, or that students have shared with me or discussed as significant. But I'll be doing a little bit of like low-key storytelling about our class and talking through these scenarios. So viewing the garden through a lens of nourishment and access, like Renee noted, access to space and kind of having a sense of place is usually not emphasized in a prisoner experience. But I think like one of the moments that made me feel most excited about eco-literacy in the garden this season was I was working with a young student, really young for an adult facility, definitely kind of a person who didn't have a horticultural background, didn't like getting their hands dirty, felt uncomfortable around insects. And so she was having a hard time feeling engaged in the garden for a lot of different reasons. But one thing she was really good at was cooking. She really liked to make salads out of the harvest, which is something I'll talk about a little later. Also something that we had to advocate for at one of our sites this year. And so oftentimes the only times she would engage me about plants in the garden would be to ask like, well, can I eat this? Because she wanted to know what she could like pick and put into the salad. And even though that's like kind of a lower entry point than we might expect or want for students entering, a horticulture curriculum, it reminded me of this statement from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. She writes, knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond. And that was where I saw eco-literacy working for this student, that they were able to now look at the world and read it as something that can nourish me or not, something I can eat, something I can prepare and share with friends or not. And that was a different way than I think she had viewed the natural world before. So even though it was a small step, it felt really significant to me. And she did make really great salads. Secondly, I want to move to talking about safety and stability. These are concepts Renee brought up under the heading of trauma-informed correctional care. The last section I'm going to be speaking on also addresses trauma-informed correctional care. But I think we'll all see that like this does also have roots in like democratic practice, right? And participatory education and trauma-informed education are very much connected for a reason. So as Renee said, food access in prisons, especially fresh food access, is pretty notoriously low and not always nutritionally suited to the populations. In 2022, the ACLU put out a report in which they stated that the typical prison diet which is high in salt, sugar, and refined carbohydrates, contributes to the elevated rates of diabetes and heart disease among the incarcerated population. People who are incarcerated in the US are also 6 times more likely to contract a foodborne illness than the general population. And I think this is important to remember, not even to kind of put down certain kinds of foods or eating habits over others, but to understand systemically what's available to people in a given food system. And in spaces of incarceration, often access to fresh food is very low. There are a lot of guidelines around what can be brought into the kitchen that prepares the food for prisoners. We'll speak more about that later if there's interest. Our produce does not always make it into those kitchens. We find other ways to engage students in using it, eating it, and circulating it. But one thing that happened this year, again, that was really useful and educational for me, was watching Renee, in this case, who was lead educator at one of our sites, really advocate with organizers of the program on the administrative side from the DOC for having a portion of class that was devoted to students being able to eat the food they were harvesting. So that wasn't seen as something that was really important in a curricular or educational or vocational or even therapeutic, although I think the strongest arguments are there, right? Sense that this wasn't a useful activity for students to eat this food. And we were able, I think, through like some sustained attempts to create a more inviting environment for that to happen. We were able to put aside a few portions of class at the very end where students could prepare and eat a meal together, which definitely increased class camaraderie. But again, also, it was something that made the class more educationally accessible because it contributed to a sense of safety and stability. Students wanted to eat this food. They were really interested in trying it, kind of negotiating the boundaries around that and what happens in the garden and how much eating happens, whether or not food can be taken back to the units, was a really ongoing conversation, as it is in many of our facilities. It's also not very standardized, so different facilities will have different rules and can be really frustrating to navigate. But just seeing kind of like the emphasis on food as something that can give students that sense of safety and stability, that is kind of looking after their interests and their health, felt really important. And a lot of that was eating the food that we produced. And in order to eat food that you produce, especially in the garden, kind of on the fly, you have to grow and cultivate certain crops that you can eat raw or that are easy to slice with a plastic knife, which is how we cut up the cantaloupes the students ate and shared together. So it definitely like gave them a new perspective on like garden planning, space use, and tailoring the use of the space to the needs of the people who were being held in it, right? The prisoners, which again is not necessarily the objective of a carceral space. So it provides a little bit of flexibility and asks the students to give some planning and some purpose to the task, which maybe they didn't anticipate because that's not a large part of carceral life in general. Finally, I just want to talk about the connection to collaboration and empowerment that food gardening had in our sites this year. In addition to making sure the food was crops that students could easily eat, students also had a lot of other motivations for growing that we were able to uncover through conversing with them about the facility, about the communities they were from, about their own needs and concerns. So among those other uses, we discussed alternative paths for harvests, like if students weren't able to eat the produce that day in the garden, which often there was more than they could eat, or there were things that they chose not to eat, trying to give students a role. Again, some of this involves a lot of coordination with administrative officials, but being able to donate the food to communities or community kitchens that students felt connected to on the outside. Some students, and I think this was a surprise to us, wanted to give the food or bring the food to the staff kitchen, which is separate from the prisoner kitchen and has less regulations about what can be used in it. So very often they would be like excited about harvesting a bunch of cilantro because they knew the chef used it in the soups, and they were proud of contributing to the environment that way. It sometimes improved their rapport with employees in the facility. And I think like all of that was an important outcome, right? All of that kind of changed the interior landscape of incarceration through this one intervention in the garden space. Finally, I just want to tell a short story about two folks that Renee and I worked closely with this year because they had a really strong and unlikely friendship in the facility we were working in. And they're both really hoping to join the program again. We're not sure where we'll be able to run in the next year, but we know that they're really eager to assist and collaborate with us further. But they also collaborated together a lot to give us lots of recommendations, but also to think more about what they wanted to plant next year and start to make plans for next year based on what they had found useful that growing season. So these two in particular were really dedicated herbalists. So I just want to call out, even though it's not technically a food use, there was a huge overlap with medicinal interests and medicinal plants. And students were really assessing. They knew if they knew their friends had a particular ailment, arthritis, or depression, right? They would, we had a guest presenter, an herbalist, come in, and they would really grill that person. Like, well, what if someone has this diagnosis? Or what if someone has pain in their knuckles? What would you suggest? And while we, wish that there are many people accommodating the needs of incarcerated people, it was really wonderful to see them trying to accommodate each other's needs and think about the herbs and plants that they would grow next year that they could see maybe actually helping specific people who are incarcerated with them. So again, that gives a connection to land, a sense of place, as we spoke about before, kind of sense of ownership of the food. That I think, as Renee pointed out, is really important in all kinds of democratic labor and agricultural practices, but definitely not emphasized in a carceral environment. So I think it has kind of some extra potency to educate around what's important for students in terms of feeling connected to the land, what's important for students in having a sense of place or understanding the ecology of both the prison garden and the prison that they live in, and how to better negotiate all of those different spaces. I'm happy to talk more about any of those examples and or share more stories. I know we both have a lot. I wanted to share a little bit about how you could get involved with us personally if you're interested. We are a Massachusetts-based organization, and I know some of you are in close proximity to us. We are often looking for volunteers, both to become educators who come in multiple times a month into our programs to lead classes and workshops, and also most especially as guest presenters. So we can have guest presenters come into facilities twice per growing season without kind of filling out the additional paperwork and background check that's required of our regular educators. And we especially welcome folks from the green industry in joining us and possibly giving us that time, because it's really useful for students in the vocational sense to be able to network with employers and understand, well, what are the expectations of this field if I'm released and looking for a job? So if that describes you, if you run an operation, if you have done any kind of hiring and can give insights into what that might look like, that's always very welcome. But all green industry related skills, we're always eager to have folks come in, visit with the students, and share their talents. We also take in-kind donations, extra tools or supply we can put to use in prison yards. There was a question about the kinds of tools that are allowed in our sites. And while those vary, we actually do have a really high level of advocacy around that. If we make a case that a particular tool would be useful, or we've gotten a donation that would have a really good home at one of the sites, we are able to have those conversations. So I think the answer to that is maybe a little more open-ended than we might expect, but we can definitely speak more about that later. And you can always give to us financially by clicking the give link at our main website, which is linked there at the bottom. So if there's any interest in kind of furthering the conversation in terms of support for us directly, again, please reach out to me. I'm very happy to take questions and comments both in the session and after the session. And as we said before, we really want to make space for folks who are thinking about starting their own programs too. So if you have a programming question that pertains to us or yourself, please feel free to reach out.
Any of you have questions?
Thanks, Rachel. That was a wonderful way to tie in both the sort of, umbrella theme of the NOFA conference with the work that we did, especially this past season. Yeah, so we welcome any questions or comments, anything, folks in the room.
We do have a question.
Yeah.
Hi there. I don't know. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Do you hear them?
Okay. So I'm actually new to the curious about a point you brought up earlier in the presentation about post-training outcomes in terms of, some of their participants actually gaining employment through your industry allies. Is there any data that can help me understand what their earnings potential are, or what the mobility potential is for the folks that are entering into and how I'm just curious to see how you can help more people get placed into this industry since we're fairly new to it. But we really like to specialize in breaking barriers for people without a 4-year degree. We actually call it STARS, or skilled through alternative routes. And that like opportunities to get with high wages and actually like better career outcomes.
So if I can just have the moderator summarize that question, because I think we only caught bits and pieces of it. Unless Rachel, you could do it.
No, it would be great. Do you mind repeating just the highlights?
Sure. Okay. So I'm just curious to know.
Oh, but yeah, we can have the
moderator do it so we can hear.
Can you summarize?
I mean, we understand that your question is about recidivism, employment rates, outcomes.
Yeah. Can you shed any light on that?
Yeah. Yes and no. So recidivism is something that a lot of people want to know about, both in terms of like, it's a very common question. A lot of grants that we apply for ask about recidivism as a means of evaluating our programming. And unfortunately, there are very strict, I shouldn't say very strict, there are boundaries that prevent us from personally tracking recidivism. We do not have contact with our students post-programming, post-our programming, post-release, unless they actively reach out to us. We do not track them in any way, nor does the state share that information with us. If they did, which they don't. I can tell you that like from a scientific standpoint, in terms of research that's being done at universities and through our colleagues nationwide, there is quantifiable evidence that supports the idea of vocational training, education in general, but specifically vocational training influencing recidivism rates in a positive manner. I don't have the latest statistics on that, so I can't tell you. And I would imagine that there's many variables that go into the rate of recidivism and exposure to vocational training. But everything is telling us that programming such as ours has a positive effect from a scientific standpoint, not just anecdotally. we don't have that information for our students. We use other ways to measure the success of our programming. Most of it, a lot of it is qualitative, meaning that it's through interviews with both staff and our students at the facilities. And also we use information such as like how much acreage we've turned over to gardens, how much produce we've produced, how much retention or lack of, what's the word I'm looking for? Attrition we have in our programming. So those are the means of us tracking or evaluating and the success of our program. I can tell you that last year we had one person that was directly hired by one of our green industry allies as a result of our bridging, our efforts to bridge those pathways. So we had a person that may or may not have been an individual that attended our vocational training program that then went into reentry, meaning they were released from being incarcerated, and they were hired by one of our green industry allies to be employed by that company. So one for 2022, and we're pretty excited about that. I know it might seem somewhat insignificant, but it's a huge accomplishment for the amount of work that we've put into growing those connections over the last 2 years. Really since the pandemic, we were able to focus more on our programming on the outside. So if you have any further follow-up questions to that, I'd love to hear them.
That's great. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Renee and Richard, could you talk about prison land and how it relates to the gardens and just horticulture in general?
Yeah, I would actually love to. So that's something we don't really talk much about in this presentation, but it's really fascinating because a lot of our state prisons were built on former agricultural land, and often are surrounded by conservation land. So I think transforming, a sort of non-native monoculture of turf into a viable biodiverse landscape that provides food to the humans at that establishment, but also to the pollinators and the wildlife is pretty fantastic. It helps to create a corridor, especially in these areas where the state prisons are surrounded by conservation land. I will say that most of our gardens are in the ground. We do have one very urban location at the Suffolk County House of Corrections that is all raised beds. And that has offered a certain unique set of obstacles in terms of it's sort of the garden itself. The raised beds are embedded in this courtyard that are surrounded by buildings that's surrounded by a city of asphalt. And so it is very much a micro climate of heat and humidity. so it offers a particular set of challenges, but what is more fascinating to me from a grower standpoint is the amount of the amount of pest problems that we still have, or I should back up and say we very much still have certain pest problems, but we don't have other pest problems that you might encounter in a more rural or open space. So we generally don't see a lot of insect pest problems until we start bringing in seedlings from that are grown elsewhere. Anything that's grown within house tends to be really clean. There's just not a lot of other vegetation to house like aphids or other problematic pest species, insect pest species. But then we have very much a rabbit presence, even with the raised beds. And I would go so far to say probably rats and other types of, rodent mammals that you would find in an urban environment. We still have those pest issues that we need to grapple with, we need to address.
Do you work with the MCI in Framingham or the Walpole?
So we have never worked with MCI Framingham. That has a very rich history of gardening and horticulture. And I say we've never worked with MCI Framingham. However, we have visited there and sort of collaborated with others that have worked there. And they actually reached out to us recently about doing programming there. But once upon a time, that was a paid position through the Department of Corrections under the Education Department, which is different than where most of our programming is housed. Like I said before, we are mostly housed under the Director of Treatment rather than the principal in the school within the facility. Framingham had always had it as part of the education that they offered their inmates. And there was, MCI Framingham, for those of you who don't know, is a medium and maximum security women's prison. And then in conjunction with that was MCI, or what was it called? South Middlesex Correctional Center, SMCC. And SMCC was a pre-release for the women that were graduating essentially for MCI Framingham. So they've since closed SSMC, South Middlesex Correctional Center, and which is great, but they, instead of releasing those individuals, they rehoused them to MCI, or I'm sorry, not MCI, Middlesex House of Corrections and Suffolk House of Corrections. And we've held programming with those women populations at both those facilities. So from my understanding, the programming at Framingham is still happening in some capacity. I think maybe through volunteers of the Concord Prison outreach group, but like I already said, I just recently heard from one of the correctional officers that we've worked with at other facilities that is at MCI Framingham now, and they invited the New Garden Society to do programming there, which we unlikely will do, to be quite honest.
What about Walpole?
Nope, never at Walpole. Don't know much about it.
Hi, I have a question that's kind of still like messy. It's more of like, what are your thoughts? I work as a gardener within a school district, and I'm seeing a lot of parallels between the work you guys do and the environment of the carceral system, and then like the environment of the school system. And like, honestly, but I'm just wondering, like, if you like have like worked with like particularly young or youth folks who are involved in the carceral system, kind of where you also see the parallels as well as like parallel problems and then like ensuing solutions. But yeah, it's like too many for me to ignore, just like how many similarities there are, like what you guys are talking about and like the things that I see within the school system.
Can you share a couple of similarities that have stood out to you?
Oh, for sure. The piece you guys said on like how empowerment and collaboration are not emphasized in a carceral environment, not letting produce into kitchens. The creation of concept questions is something that I do with the kids to kind of like guide the season. Viewing like food access as like owning your food and like the devaluing of nutrition is massive in that like the Department of Defense funds school meals. It's kind of everywhere. It's like a lot of different pieces, whether it's like the educational piece or like the school system is like a source of access for resources. Which like kind of like the carceral system where it's like it has to provide resources to all of the people who are within it. The school has to do the same and they do it in very similar ways. And so like to do something like this is like kind of working against it. I don't know if, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'll speak briefly, and then Renee can as well if she likes, about similarities I've seen to like university food systems. So my other job is in a university system, and sometimes watching the ways like university students are, in some ways, you're right, like for different reasons, they are kind of a time short, very regulated kind of population that's directed toward food in these really specific sites, right? Cafeterias, et cetera. And then the thing that is actually really interesting to me that I've done some thinking about this year is that, exactly as you're saying, many schools, both in higher ed and as well as high school and elementary schools, have like food provision contracts. They'll often have a large company contracted to like provide all of the food in the cafeteria, and due to like clauses designed to discourage competition, that's where a lot of those guidelines come in of like, no, we can't bring the tomatoes into the kitchen because it violates this contract, not necessarily because of like in-house rules in the facilities themselves. And a lot of times the providers of these food contracts are the same, right? Aramark provides very different quality and sometimes takes food that was intended for school environments. And if they feel like it's past its date or past its peak, it will move into a prison facility. That's definitely a food chain we've observed happening in Massachusetts. But they're often the same team of people responsible for like creating those food systems and providing the food that is distributed within them. And some of those same companies also employ convict leasing, and they have incarcerated people doing or sourcing some of that agricultural work. So there's definitely a lot of tie-ins at a systemic level that have given me some thought. There's also there's a lot of, one thing your question makes me think of, which is kind of like a question in response to a question, is I have seen some movement around getting like fresh food or farm grown food into schools. It's a little harder to make that argument around prisons, especially like, again, just with the innovations you'd need to the contracts that dictate the food distribution. Also because unlike students at any level, prisoners are kind of a politically unpopular group. So, while my students in the New Garden Society are my students, and I think of them as students in a lot of grant applications, they're positioned as students, but also like as prisoners, right? Or as people who are incarcerated. And I think there's just sometimes a little less energy for providing kind of a just and sustainable environment for incarcerated people than there may be for people living in other kinds of facilities or institutions. And that's something that kind of eternally interests me, because so many incarcerated people are students, sometimes in school, sometimes not. But I do think there are a lot of similarities that I wish I could make more visible to people in the everyday, if that makes sense. Renee, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, well, I think what you stated so far is like well said. A lot of it does have to do with those pre-existing contracts, and to a certain extent also the logistics of the kitchen, where they might not have the proper equipment to store or process fresh foods, where they're maybe not even doing actual cooking at a facility that they're feeding so many people at. We've heard those arguments as well, that they don't have the resources to sort of absorb fresh produce. And trying to think of some of the other similarities that you talked about. Rachel really covered a lot of the politics behind it. And I do use that term intentionally. You know, when we talk about the privatization of our schools and prisons, we're really talking about these types of services that are impacting the way the community, in this case, the New Garden Society and the residents that live there, have an influence over those services. They're no longer state and city related once you outsource and privatize all those services with contracts. Yeah, I think that's all I have for now. If I think of something else, or if you want to remind me of another similarity, maybe I can talk a little bit further about that.
I have a question about the vocational training in terms of preparing students for what it's like working maybe seasonal jobs, and the idea that they might be either like unemployed during the winter or have very lean hours, that these are jobs where you might not be able to get health insurance, those kind of things. If that's like part of your curriculum.
Yes and no to a certain extent. I think when we talk about the sort of the breadth and depth of different vocations within the industries, I think that both the educators and the guest presenters that we have talk about some of the pros and cons in reality, and the fact that within certain sectors of the industry, the work is likely to be seasonal as opposed to year-round. But so much of the industry is year-round in different capacities. It's like anything else, like a good farm plan. You have to kind of diversify and you know, be a polyculture, right? So any good green industry, you know, I come from a horticultural background, meaning I've worked in a lot of commercial and private landscapes in high-end landscaping companies. And so once you start diversifying your services, the work becomes a lot less seasonal. It becomes year-round, whether we're doing holiday decorations, you might do some snow plowing, or be jumping into, you know, growing annuals and perennials for your clients as early as February. But yeah, we share the realities, the pros and cons. You know, I mean, for a long time, I have to say, working seasonal and having my winters off was a big perk to working in the industry. I felt like I did my time during the growing season. I needed a few months to relax, but also I recognize the privilege and the other choices that I made in my life to have that be a blessing rather than a curse. So I will acknowledge that.
I was also curious about why you had to make the distinction, or why the distinction between being educational or therapeutic was important, or something that you had to take into account to move your program forward.
Yeah, so I again, it really came down to sort of like the box in which the facilities themselves or the DOC placed us in to avoid having to pay for our services, to be quite honest. So, you know, vocational training that is housed under the education department of a facility is either usually done in-house, meaning they hire someone to work for the state or the city to provide that programming, or they hire an outside agency as a consultant to provide those services. When you have a program under the director of treatment. That program is essentially considered to be like a well-being program, like yoga or religion. So it was like really a loophole that the prison system created to like to ensure that these were services that they were going to receive at a pro bono rate. So for example, most of the places that we have provided programming, we have done so for free. There are other facilities which are more likely to pay for our services, namely DYS, working with detained youth, and the House of Corrections when the programming falls under their education department. They hire us as an outside consultant to provide those services, or even in some cases, as with the DYS, we're a subcontractor of the educational services that are already contracted out by the state to provide educational programming to detained youth.
Another question I also had was like, how long or how often or when do you do trainings for people to get involved, or are there trainings before getting involved? Just how people can get involved.
Yeah, wonderful question. I'll let Rachel answer this.
Yeah, definitely. For guest presentation, or depending on the level of involvement someone wants, I'm assuming this is someone who's just interested in being involved with the programming and not in making donations, for which there's very little orientation background. But guest presenters, we don't do something formal. A lot of our guest presenters are returning. Most of the time we'll be kind of coordinating logistics with them beforehand. If you'd like to be solicited for a guest presenter, you can definitely sign up on our mailing list on our website. But usually the guest presentation preparation is done in collaboration with the lead educator at the site. So you would have, plenty of time to review what they had available for that day, if you wanted to use it, to submit your own materials, and really just to talk about like, okay, what does a class look like? What do the students enjoy? What kind of materials can we bring in? What's the timeline for getting them approved? And that's been fairly successful, just working out on like a person by person basis. Educators do attend both an opening orientation. Previously, this has often been focused on trauma-informed correctional care, but we do kind of ongoing training throughout the year. Every month, we invite educators to a professional development meeting where we cover some aspect of curricular design, of pedagogy, or just of kind of questions and concerns that the educators have been bringing, sometimes very specifically related to the sites that they're housed in and sometimes not. Absolutely, there's so much to learn before going into a site about the site itself, what parking is like, what the neighborhood is like. They're not always, facilities are not always super conducive to that, especially the ones Renee mentioned earlier, which are in really densely populated urban settings. So we do try to make sure that a lot of that comes into place beforehand, because it can be stressful enough trying to enter a secure facility and deliver a lesson when, it's an institution. Like any institutional planning, often something might go wrong, right? If your handouts might not be printed for you, you can't bring in your own handouts, or maybe you made a mistake getting something approved and aren't able to bring it in. So just having that kind of background is, I think, kind of the most important for people coming in for the first time, whether that be as a guest presenter or as an educator. But we do have a lot of ongoing training for our long-term volunteers.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that and say, like, in summary, if you want to donate money or services, that don't involve you coming into the prison, or in-kind donations of any kind. No orientation is really needed other than just coordinating, having conversations with Rachel or myself. If you're a guest presenter, again, that lead educator at the facility will sort of coach you on what to expect the day of, what to wear. And if you're a volunteer educator that you're going to make the commitment for an entire season and attend regularly, you'll go through extensive training, both an orientation from the New Garden Society. You'll also have to do an orientation with the DOC or the HOC. That is pretty brief and painless. And then you'll have both continuing education through the New Garden Society, supervision from your lead educator, and all our educators co-teach so that no one is there as an individual trying to deal with the uncertainties of walking into a carceral setting. Most of the uncertainties come from the administration, not the population that's housed there. So the only people that would ever be like facilitating programming individually would be a lead educator such as myself or Rachel, like an employee of the New Garden Society, rather than our volunteer educators.
Thank you, Rachel and Renee. I think we've reached the time for our conclusion. So thank you so much for your presentation. I just have to remind everyone that we do have an evaluation. I think the QR codes are outside the door. And there's also the QR codes for the bulk order and for the auction. And yeah, I think we all will have access to your contact info because personally I'm very interested too. So we can stay in touch.
And we will be having a, well, first, thank you very much for moderating this. It's very helpful to have someone that is there in person. If people wanted to give us their names and email addresses, if the moderator could do that, that would be appreciated. We will certainly add you to our mailing list if you indicate for us to do so, and also keep you in touch with, keep you informed about volunteering for the New Garden Society, because we do have an informative open house that will be coming up probably next month to answer a lot, to really dive into the logistics of being a volunteer educator and what that will look like. And at that open house, it's a good opportunity to hear other educators' experience, and we'll have a little bit more information at that time as to what facilities we're going to be at this season and where they're located, and that sort of information. So, be in touch, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy the rest of your conference.